Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe to the channel, like, and share. We are reading We the Living by Anne Rand. Chapter Part 2, Chapter 9. Comrade Victor Dunai, one of our youngest and most brilliant engineers, has been assigned to a job on the Volkovostroy, the great hydroelectric project of the Soviet Union. It is a responsible post, never held previously by one of his ears. The clipping from Pravda lay in Victor's glistening new briefcase, along with a similar one from the Krasnaya Gazeta. And folded carefully between them, a clipping from the Moscow Izvestia, even though it was only one line about Comrade V. Dunaev. Victor carried the briefcase when he left for the construction site on Lake Volkhov. A few hours' ride from Petrograd, a delegation from his party club came to see him off at the station. He made a short, effective speech about the future of proletarian construction from the platform of the car and forgot to kiss Marisha when the train started moving. The speech was reproduced in the club's wall newspapers on the following day. Marisha had to remain in Petrograd. She had her course at the RepFac to finish and her social activities. She had suggested timidly that she would be willing to give them up and accompany Victor, but he had insisted on her remaining in the city. My dear, we must not forget, he had told her, that our social duties come first, above all personal considerations. He had promised to come home whenever he was back in the city. She saw him once, unexpectedly, at a meeting. He explained hurriedly that he could not come home with her, for he had to take the midnight train back to the construction site. She said nothing, even though she knew there was no midnight train. She had developed a tendency to be too silent. At the Komsomol meetings, she made her reports in a strident, indifferent voice. When caught off guard, she sat staring vacantly ahead, her eyes puzzled. She was left alone in the big, empty rooms of the Dunaev apartment. Victor had talked intimately to a few influential officials, and no tenant had been ordered to occupy their vacant rooms. But the silence of the apartment frightened Marisha, so she spent her evenings with her family in her old room next to Kira's. When Marisha appeared, her mother sighed and muttered some complaints about the rations at the cooperative and bent silently over her mending. Her father said good evening and gave no further sign of noticing her presence. Her little brother said, "You here again?" She had nothing to say. She sat in a corner behind the grand piano, reading a book until late at night. Then she said, "Guess I'll be going," and went home. One evening she saw Kira crossing the room hurriedly on her way out. Marisha leaped to her feet, smiling eagerly, hopefully, although she did not know why, nor what she hoped for, nor whether she had anything to say to Kira. She made a timid step forward and stopped. Kira had not noticed her and had gone out. Marisha sat down slowly, still smiling, vacantly. Snow had come early. It grew by Petrograd sidewalks in craggy mountain ranges, veined with thin black threads of soot, spotted with brown clots and cigarette stubs and greenish fading stacks of newspapers. But under the walls of the houses, snow grew slowly, undisturbed, soft, white, billowing, pure as cotton, rising to the top panes of basement windows. Above the streets, window sills hung as wide overload shelves, cornices sparkled, trimmed with the glass lace of long icicles, into an icy summer blue sky. Little billows of pink smoke rose slowly, melting like petals of apple blossoms. High on the roof, snow gathered into menacing white walls behind iron railings. Men in heavy mittens swung shovels high over the city and hurled huge frozen white clots as rocks down to the pavements below. They crashed with a dull thud and a thin white cloud. Sleighs whirled sharply to avoid them. Hungry sparrows, their feathers fluffed, scattered from under muffled thumping hoofs. On street corners, huge cauldrons stood encased in boxes of unpainted boards. Men with shovels swung the snow up into the cauldron, and narrow streams of dirty water gurgled from under the furnaces, running by the curve. Long black threads cutting white streets. At night, the furnaces blazed open in the darkness like little purplish orange fires low over the ground, and ragged men slipped out of the night, bending to extend frozen hands into the red glow. Kira walked soundlessly through the palace garden. A narrow track of footprints, half buried under a fresh white powder, led through the deep snow of the pavilion. Andre's footprints she knew few visitors were ever crossed that garden. Tree trunks stood bare, black and dead like telegraph poles. The palace windows were dark, but far at the end of the garden, showing through the stiff, naked branches, a bright yellow square hung in the darkness, and a little patch of snow was golden pink under Andre's window. She rose slowly up the long marble stairway. There was no light. Her foot searched uncertainly for every frozen, slippery step. It was colder than in the street outside. The dead damp, still cold of a mausoleum. Hesitantly, her hand followed the broken rail. She could see nothing ahead. It seemed as if the steps would never end. When she came to a break in the railing, she stopped. She called helplessly, with a little note of laughter in her frightened voice. Andre! A wedge of light split the darkness above as he flung the door open. Oh, Kira! He rushed down to her, laughing apologetically. I'm so sorry. It's those broken electric wires. He swung her up into his arms and carried her into his room, while she laughed. I'm sorry, Andre. I'm getting to be such a helpless coward. He carried her to the blazing fireplace. He took her coat off and hat, his fingers wet with snow melting on her fur collar. He made her sit down by the fire, removed her mittens, and rubbed her cold fingers between his strong palms. He unfastened her new felt overshoes and took them off, shaking snow that sizzled on the bright red coals. Then he turned silently, took a long narrow box, dropped it in her lap, and stood watching her, smiling. She asked, What is this, Andre? Something from abroad? She tore the paper and opened the box. Her mouth fell open without a sound. The box held a nightgown of black chiffon, so transparent that she saw the flames of the fire dancing through its thin black folds. As she held it high in frightened, incredulous fingers, Andre, where did you get that? From a smuggler? Andre, you buying from a smuggler? Why not? From an illegal speculator? Oh, why not? I wanted it. I knew you would want it. But there was a time when there was, not now. Her fingers wrinkled the black chiffon as if they were empty. Well, he asked, don't you like it? Oh, Andre, she moaned. Andre, do they wear these things like that abroad? Evidently. Black underwear? How? Oh, how silly and how lovely. That's what they do abroad. They are not afraid of doing silly things that are lovely. They consider it reason enough to do things because they are lovely. She laughed. Andre, they would throw you out of the party if they heard you say that. Kira, would you like to go abroad? The black nightgown fell to the floor. He smiled calmly, bending to pick it up. I'm sorry. Did I frighten you, Kira? What? What did you say? Listen. He was kneeling suddenly by her side, his arms around her, his eyes intent with a reckless eagerness she had never seen in them before. It's an idea I have had for some time. At first, I thought it was insane, but it keeps coming back to me. Kira, we could, you understand, abroad, forever. But Andre, it can be done. I could still manage to be sent there, get an assignment, some secret mission for the GPU. I would get you a passport to go as my secretary. Once across the border, we would drop the assignment and our red passports and our names. We would run away so far they would never find us. Andre, do you know what you are saying? Yes, only I don't know what I would do there. I don't know yet. I don't dare to think about it when I'm alone. But I can think of it. I can talk of it when you are here with me. I want to escape before I see too much of what I see around us. To break with all of it at once. It would be like starting again from the beginning, from a total void. But I would have you. The rest doesn't matter. I would grow to understand what I am just beginning to learn from you now. Andre, she stammered, you were the best your party had to offer the world. Well, say it. Say I'm a traitor. Maybe I am, and maybe I've just stopped being one. Maybe I've been a traitor all these years to something greater than what the party ever offered the world. I don't know. I don't care. I feel as if I were naked, naked and empty and clear. Because you see, I feel certain of nothing in that involved mess they call existence, of nothing but you. He noticed a look in her eyes and asked softly, what's the matter, Kira? Have I said anything to frighten you? She whispered without looking at him. No, Andre. It's only what I said once about my highest reverence, remember? Yes. Kira, will you marry me? Her hands fell limply. She looked at him silently, her eyes wide and pleading. Kira, dearest, don't you see what we are doing? Why do we have to hide and lie? Why do I have to live in this agony of counting hours, days, weeks between our meetings? Why have I no right to call you in those hours when I think I'll go insane if I don't see you? Why do I have to keep silent? Why can't I tell them all? Tell men like Leo Kovalensky that you are mine, that you are my wife. She did not look frightened any longer. The name he had pronounced had given her courage, her greatest, coldest battlefield courage. She said, Andre, I can't. Why? Would you do something for me if I asked you very urgently? Anything. Don't ask me why. All right? And I can't go abroad, but if you want to go alone, let's forget it, Kira. I won't ask any questions, but as for my going alone, don't you think you shouldn't say that? She laughed, jumping up. Yes, let's forget it. Let's have our own bit of Europe here. I'm going to try your gift on. Turn around and don't look. He obeyed. When he turned again, she was standing at the fireplace, her arms crossed behind her head, fire flickering behind the black silhouette of her body through a thin black mist. He was bending her backward so that the locks of her hair, tumbling down, looked red in the glow of the fire. He was whispering, Kira, I wasn't complaining tonight. I'm happy. Happy that I have nothing but left but you. She moaned. Andre, don't say it. Please, please don't say it. He did not say it again, but his eyes, his arms, the body she felt against her body, cried to her without sound, I have nothing left but you. Nothing but you. She came home long after midnight. Her room was dark, empty. She sat wearily down on the bed to wait for Leo. She fell asleep, exhausted, her hair spilled over the foot of the bed, her body huddled in her crumpled red dress. The telephone awakened her. It was ringing fiercely, insistently. She jumped up. It was daylight. The lamp was still burning on the table. She was alone. She staggered to the telephone, her eyes closing heavily, her eyelids leaden. Hello, she muttered, leaning against the wall, her eyes closed. Is that you, Kira Alexandrovna? An unctuous masculine voice asked, drawing vowels meticulously with an anxious note in the pleasant inflection. Yes, said Kira. Who? It's Karp Morozov speaking. Kira Alexandrovna. Kira Alexandrovna, soul of mine, can you come over and take that Lev Segrevich home? Really, he shouldn't be seen at my house so often. It seems there was a party and I'll be right over, said Kira, her eyes wide open, dropping the receiver. She dressed hurriedly. She could not fasten her coat. Her fingers would not slip the button through the buttonholes. Her fingers were trembling. It was Morozov who opened the door when she arrived. He was in his shirt sleeves, and a vest was fastened too tightly, pulled in taut little wrinkles across his broad stomach. He bowed low, like a peasant. Ah, Kira Alexandrovna, soul of mine, how are we today? Sorry I had to trouble you, but come right in, come right in. The white panelled lobby smelled of lilac and mothballs. Behind a half open door, she heard Leo laughing, a gay, ringing, carefree laughter. She walked straight into the dining room without waiting for Morozov's invitation. In the dining room, a table was set for three. Antonina Pavlovna held a teacup, her little fingers crooked delicately over its handle. She wore an oriental kimono. Powder was caked in white patches on her nose. Lipstick was smeared in a blot between her nose and chin. Her eyes seemed very small without makeup, puffed and weary. Leo sat at the table in his black trousers and dress shirt, his sonorously tying to his collar thrown open, his tie loose, his hair disheveled. He was laughing sonorously, trying to balance an egg on the edge of a knife. He raised his head and looked at Kira, astonished. His face was fresh, young, radiant as on an early spring morning, a face that nothing, it seemed, could mar or alter. Kira, what are you doing here? Kira Alexandrovna just happened to. Morozov began timidly, but Kira interrupted bluntly. He called me. Why you? Leo whirled on Morozov, his face turned into a vicious snarl. That he shook his head and laughed again as swiftly and suddenly. Oh hell, that's a good one. So they all think that I have a wet nurse to watch me. Lev Segrovich, soul of mine, I didn't mean to. Shut up, Leo ordered and turned to Kira. Well, since you are here, take your coat off and sit down and have some breakfast. Tonia, see if you have another couple of eggs. We are going home, Leo, Kira said quietly. He looked at her and shrugged. If you insist, and rose slowly. Morozov picked up his unfinished cup of tea. He poured it into his saucer and held the saucer on the tips of his finger and drank, sucking loudly. He said, looking at Kira, then at Leo, hesitantly, over the edge of the saucer. You see, it was like this. I called Kira Alexandrovna because I was afraid that you weren't well, Lev Segrovich, and you were drunk. Leo finished his for him. Oh no, but I was yesterday, but not this morning. You had no business. It was just a little party, Kira Alexandrovna. Antonina Pavlovna interrupted soothingly. I suppose we did stay a little too late, and it was 5 o'clock when you crawled into bed, Morozov growled. I know because you bumped into my bed and upset the water pitcher. Well, Leo brought me home, Antonina Pavlovna continued, ignoring him, and I presume he must have been a little tired. A little, Morozov began. Drunk, Leo finished for him, shrugging. Plenty drunk, if you ask me. Morozov's freckles disappeared in a red flush of anger. Just so drunk that I get up this morning and find him sprawled on the Davenport in the lobby, full dress and all, and you couldn't have awakened him with an earthquake. Well, Leo asked indifferently, what of it? It was a grand party, said Antonina Pavlovna. And how Leo can spend money? It was thrilling to watch. Really, Leo darling, you were too reckless though. What did I do? I don't remember. Well, I didn't mind it when you lost so much on the roulette, and it was cute when you paid them 10 rubles for every cheap glass you broke. But really, you didn't have to give the waiters 100 rubles tip. Why not? Let them see the difference between a gentleman and the red trash of today. Yes, but you didn't have to pay the orchestra 50 rubles to shut up every time they played something you didn't like. And then when you chose the prettiest girl in the crowd, whom you had never seen before, and you offered her any price she named to undress before the guests, you stuck those 100 down her décolleté. Well, Leo shrugged. She had a beautiful body. Let's go, Leo, said Kira. Wait a minute, Lev Segrovich, Morozov said slowly, putting his saucer down. Just where did you get all that money? I don't know, said Leo. Tonia gave it to me. Antonina, where did you? Oh, Antonina Pavlovna raised her eyebrows and looked bored. I took that package you had under the waste basket. Tonia, Morozov roared, jumping up so that the dishes rattled on the table. You didn't take that. Certainly I took it. Antonina Pavlovna tilted her chin defiantly. And I'm not accustomed to being reproached about money. I took it, and that's that. So what are you going to do about it? My God, oh my God, oh my God, Lord in heaven. Morozov gasped his head and nodded, rocking like a toy with a broken spring. What are we going to do? That was the money we owe Syrov. It was due yesterday and we haven't got another ruble on hand. And Sarah, well, if I don't deliver it today, he will kill me. What am I going to do? He won't be kept waiting and oh, he won't, Leo chuckled coldly. Well, he'll wait and he'll like it. Stop whining like a mutt. What are you afraid of? He can do nothing to us and he knows it. I'm surprised at you, Lev Sevgrovich, Morozov growled, his freckles round and red. You get your fair share, don't you? Do you think it was honorable to take. Honorable? Leo laughed resonantly, his gayest, lightest, most insulting laughter. Are you speaking to me, my dear friend? I have acquired the greatest privilege of not having to worry about that word at all. Not at all. In fact, if you find something particularly dishonorable, you may be sure I'll do it. The lower, the better. I wish you a good day. Come on, Kira. He looked around uncertainly. Where the hell is my hat? Don't you remember, Leo? Antonina Pavlovna reminded him gently. You lost it on the way home. That's right, I did. Well, I'll buy another one. Buy three of them. So long. Kira called a sleigh, and they rode home in silence. When they were alone in their room, Leo said brusquely, I won't have any criticism from you or anybody else, and you particularly have no complaints to make. I haven't slept with any other woman, if that's what you are worried about, and that's all you have to know. I wasn't worried, Leo. I have no complaints to make and no criticism. But I want to speak to you. Will you listen? He said. Sure, indifferently, and sat down. She knelt before him and slipped her arms around him and shook her hair back, her eyes wide, intent, her voice tense with the calm of a last effort. Leo, I can't reproach you. I can't blame you. I know what you're doing. I know why you are doing it. But listen, it's not too late. They haven't got you. You still have time. Let's make an effort. A last one. Let's save all we can and apply for a foreign passport. Let's run to the point of the earth that's the farthest from this damned country. He looked into her flaming eyes with eyes that were like mirrors which could not reflect a flame any longer. Why bother? He asked. Leo, I know what you will say. You have no desire to live, you don't care anymore. But listen, do it without desire. Even if you don't believe you will ever care again, just postpone your final judgment on yourself. Postpone until Postpone it till you get there, when you're free in a human country again. Then see if you still want to live. You little fool. Do you think they give foreign passport to men with my record? Leo, we have to try. We can't give up. We can't go on for 1 minute without that hope ahead of us. Leo, it can't get you. I won't let it get to you. Who, the GPU? How are you going to stop it? No, not the GPU. Forget the GPU. There's something worse. Much worse. It got Victor. It got Andre. It got Mother. It won't get you. What do you mean it got Victor? Are you comparing me to that bootlicking rat that Leo, the bootlicking rat and all those things? That's nothing. There's something much worse than it's done to Victor. Underneath, deeper, more final, and the bootlicking, it's only a consequence. It does that. It kills something. Have you ever seen plants grown without sunlight, without air? I won't let it do that to you. Let it take 150 million living creatures, but not you, Leo. Not you, my highest reverence. What an exaggerated expression. Where did you get that? She stared at him, repeated. Where did I? Really, Kira, sometimes I wonder why you have never outgrown that tendency to be so serious about everything. Nothing is getting me. Nothing is doing anything to me. I am doing what I please, which is more than you can say about anyone else these days. Leo, listen. There's something I want to do, to try. We have lots of things to untangle, you and I both, and it's not easy. Let's try to slash it all off at once. By doing what? Leo, let's get married. Huh? He stared at her incredulously. She repeated, Let's get married. He threw his head back and laughed. He laughed resonantly. A clear, light, icy laughter, as he had laughed at Andrei Taganov, as he had laughed at Morozov. What is this, Kira? The make an honest woman of you nonsense? No, it's not that. Rather late for the two of us, isn't it? Why not, Leo? What for? Do we need it? No. Then why do it? I don't know, but I'm asking it. That's not reason enough to do something senseless. I'm not in a mood to become a respectable husband. If you are afraid of losing me, no scrap of paper scribbled by a red clerk is going to hold me. I'm not afraid of losing you. I'm afraid that you will lose yourself. But a couple of rubles at the Zach's and the Apravdom's blessing will save my soul, is that it? Leo, I have no reasons to offer, but I am asking it. Are you delivering an ultimatum? She said softly with a quiet smile of surrender and resignation. No. Then we will forget about it. Yes, Leo. He slipped his hands under her armpits and pulled her up into his arms and said wearily, you crazy, hysterical child. You drive yourself into a fit over some weird fears. Now forget it. We'll save every ruble from now on if that's what you want. You can put it away for a trip to Monte Carlo or San Francisco or the planet Jupiter. And we won't talk about it again, all right? He was smiling, his arrogant smile on a face that remained incredibly beautiful, a face that was like on a drug to her, inexplicable, unconditional, consummate like music. She buried her head on his shoulder, repeating helplessly, hopelessly, a name as a drug. Leo, Leo, Leo. That brings us to the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10. Pavel Sirov had a drink before he came to his office. He had another drink in the afternoon. He had telephoned Morozov, and a voice he knew to be Morozov's had told him that the citizen Morozov was not at home. He paced up and down his office and splashed an inkstand. He found a misspelled word in a letter he had dictated and threw the letter, crumbled into a twisted ball, at his secretary's face. He telephoned Morozov and got no answer. A woman telephoned him, and her soft, lisping voice said sweetly, insistently, but Pavlusha, darling, you promised me that bracelet. A speculator brought a bracelet tied in a corner of a dirty handkerchief and refused to leave it without the full amount in cash. Syrov telephoned Morozov at the food trust. A secretary demanded to know who was calling. Syrov slammed the receiver down without answering. He roared at a ragged applicant for a job that he would turn him over to the GPU and ordered his secretary to throw out all those waiting to see him. He left the office an hour earlier than usual and slammed the door behind him. He walked past Morozov's house on his way home and hesitated but saw a militia man on the corner and did not enter. A dinner which had been sent from a communal kitchen 2 blocks away and was cold with grease floating over the cabbage soup. Comrade Sonia said, really, Pavel, I've got to have a fur coat. I can't allow myself to catch a cold, for the child's sake. And no rabbit fur either. I know you can afford it. Oh, I'm not saying anything about anyone's little activities, but I'm just keeping my eyes open. He threw his napkin into the soup and left the table without eating. He called Morozov's house and let the telephone ring for 5 minutes. There was no answer. He sat on the bed, emptied a bottle of vodka. Comrade Sonia left for a meeting of the Teachers' Council of an evening school for illiterate women house workers. He emptied a second bottle. Then he rose resolutely, swaying a little, pulled his belt tight across his fur jacket and went to Morozov's house. He rang 3 times. There was no answer. He kept his fingers on the bell button, leaning indifferently against the wall. He heard no sound behind the door, but he heard steps rising up the stairs, and he flung himself into the darkest corner of the landing. The steps died on the floor below, and he heard a door opening and closing. He could not let himself be seen with waiting there. He remembered dimly. He reached for his notebook and wrote, pressing the notebook to the wall in the light of a street lamp outside. Morozov, you goddamn bastard. If you don't come across with what's due me before tomorrow morning, you will eat breakfast at the GPU, and you know what that means. Affectionately, Pavel Sirov. He folded the note and slipped it under the door. 5 minutes later, Morozov stepped noiselessly out of his bathroom and tiptoed to the lobby. He listened nervously but heard no sound on the stair landing. Then he noticed a faint blur of white in the darkness on the floor. He picked up the note and read it, bending under the dining room lamp. His face looked grey. The telephone rang. He shuddered, frozen to the spot, as if the eyes somewhere behind that ringing bell could see him with the note in his hand. He crammed the note deep into his pocket and answered the telephone, trembling. It was an old aunt of his, and she sniffed into the receiver, asking to borrow some money. He called her an old bitch and hung up. Through the open bedroom door, Antonina Pavlovna, sitting at a dressing table, brushing her hair, called out into a piercing voice, objecting to the use of such language. He whirled upon her ferociously. If it weren't for you and that damn lover of yours, Antonina Pavlovna shrieked. He is not my lover. Yet. If he were, do you think I would be squatting around a sloppy old fool like you? They had a quarrel. Morozov forgot about the note in his pocket. The European roof garden had a ceiling of glass panes. It looked like a black void, staring down, crushing those below, more implacable than a steel vault. There were lights, yellow lights that looked dim in an oppressive haze with the which was cigarette smoke, or heat, or the black abyss above. There were white tables and yellow glints in the silverware. Men sat at the tables, yellow sparks flashed in their diamond studs and in the beads of moisture on their red, flushed faces. They ate, they bent eagerly over their plates, they chewed hurriedly, incredulously. They were not out on a carefree evening in a gay night spot. They were eating. In a corner, a yellowish bald head bent over a red steak on a white plate. The man cut the steak, smacking his fleshy red lips. Across the table, a red-headed girl of 15 ate hastily, her head drawn into her shoulders. When she raised her head, she blushed from the tip of her short, freckled nose to her white, freckled neck, and her mouth was twisted as if she were going to scream. A fierce jet of smoke swayed by a dark window pane. A thin individual with a long face that betrayed too closely its future appearance as a skull rocked monotonously on the black back legs of his chair and smoked without interruption, holding a cigarette in long yellow fingers, spouting smoke out of white nostrils, frozen in a sardonic, unhealthy grin. When women moved among the tables with an awkward, embarrassed insolence, a head of soft golden waves nodded unsteadily under a light, wide eyes in deep blue rings, a young mouth open in a vicious, sneering smile. In the middle of the room, a gaunt, dark woman with knobs on her shoulders, holes under her collarbones, and a skin the color of muddy coffee, was laughing too loudly, opening painted lips like a gash over strong white teeth and very red gums. The orchestra played John Gray. It flung brief, blunt notes out into space as if tearing them off the strings before they were ripe, hiding the gap of an uncapturable gaiety under a convulsive rhythm. Waiters glided soundlessly through the crowd and bent over the tables, obsequious and exaggerated, and their flabby jowls conveyed expressions of respect and mockery, and pity for those guilty, awkward ones who made such an effort to be gay. Morozov did remember that he had to raise money before morning. He came to the European roof garden alone. He sat at three different tables, smoked four different cigars, and whispered confidentially into five different ears that belonged to corpulent men who did not seem to be in a hurry. At the end of 2 hours, he had the money in his wallet. He mopped his forehead with relief, sat alone at a table in a dark corner, and ordered cognac. Stefan Timoshenko leaned so far across a white tablecloth that he seemed to be lying on rather than sitting at the table. His head was propped on his elbow, his fingers on the nape of his broad neck. He had a glass in his other hand. When the glass was empty, he held it uncertainly in the air, wondering how to refill it with one hand. He solved the problem by dropping the glass with a sonorous crash and lifting the bottle to his lips. The maitre d'hotel looked at him crash and lifting the bottle to his Maitre de l'Hotel looked at him nervously, sidewise, frowning. He frowned at the jacket with the rabbit fur collar, at the crumpled sailor cap sliding over one ear, at the muddy shoes flung out onto the satin train of a woman at the next table. But the Maitre de Hotel had to be cautious. Stefan Timoshenko had been there before. Everyone knew that he was a party member. A waiter slid unobtrusively up to his table and gathered the broken glass into a dustpan. Another waiter brought a sparkling clean glass and slipped into his finger gently over Timoshenko's bottle, whispering, "May I help you, citizen?" "Go to hell," said Timoshenko, and pushed the glass across the table with the back of his hand. The glass vacillated on the edge and crashed down. "I'll do as I please," Timoshenko roared, and heads turned to him to look at him. I'll drink out of a bottle if I please. Bottle if I'll please. I'll drink out of two bottles. But citizen, want me to show you how? Timoshenko asked, his eyes gleaming ominously. No, indeed, citizen, the waiter said hastily. Go to hell, said Timoshenko with soft persuasion. I don't like your snoot. I don't like any of the snoots around here. He rose, swaying, roaring. I don't like any of the damn snoots around here. The staggered among the tables, the Maitre Hotel whispered gently at his elbow. If you are not feeling well, citizen, out of my way, bellowed Timoshenko, tripping over a woman's slipper. He had almost reached the door when he stopped suddenly and his face melted into a wide, gentle smile. Ah, he said, a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine. He staggered to Morozov, swung a chair high over someone's head, planted it with a resounding smash at Morozov's table, and sat down. I beg your pardon, citizen. Morozov gasped, rising. Sit still, pal, said Timoshenko, and his huge tanned paw pressed Morozov's shoulder down like a sledgehammer, so that Morozov fell back on his chair with a thud. Can't run away from a friend, Comrade Morozov. We are friends with a, you know. Old friends? Well, maybe you don't know me. Stefan Timoshenko is the name. Stefan Timoshenko of the Red Ball Fleet. He added as an afterthought. Oh, said Morozov. Oh, yes, said Timoshenko. An old friend, an admirer of yours. And you know what? No, said Morozov. We gotta have a drink together like good old pals. We gotta have a drink. Waiter, he roared so loudly that a violinist missed a note of John Gray. Bring us two bottles, Timoshenko ordered when a waiter bowed hesitantly over his shoulder. No, bring us three bottles. Three bottles of what, citizen? The waiter asked timidly. Of anything, said Timoshenko. No, wait. What's the most expensive? What is it that the good fat capitalist guzzle in proper style? Champagne, citizen? Make it champagne and damn quick. 3 bottles and 2 glasses. When the waiter brought the champagne, Timoshenko poured it and planted a glass before Morozov. There, said Timoshenko with a friendly smile. Going to drink with me, pal? Yes, comrade, said Morozov meekly. Thank you, comrade. Your health, comrade Morozov, said Timoshenko solemnly, raising his glass. To Comrade Morozov, citizen of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. They clinked their glasses. Morozov glanced around furtively, helplessly, but no help was coming. He drank, the glass trembling at his lips. Then he smiled ingratiatingly. This was very nice of you, comrade, he muttered, rising. And I appreciate it very much, comrade. Now, if you don't mind, I've got to be going and sit still, ordered Timoshenko. He refilled his glass and raised it, leaning back, smiling, but his smile did not seem friendly any longer, and his dark eyes were looking at Morozov steadily, sardonically. To the great citizen Morozov, the man who beat the revolution, he said and laughed resonantly, and emptied the glass in one gulp, his head thrown back. Comrade, Morozov muttered through his lips he could barely force open. Comrade, what do you mean? Timoshenko laughed louder and leaned across the table towards Morozov, his elbows crossed, his cap far back on his head over sticky ringlets of dark hair. The laughter stopped abruptly as if slashed off. Timoshenko said softly, persuasively, with a smile that frightened Morozov more than the laughter. Don't look so scared, Comrade Morozov. You don't have to be afraid of me. I'm nothing but a beaten wretch, beaten by you, Comrade Morozov. And all I want is to tell you humbly that I know I'm beaten, and I hold no grudge. Hell, I hold a profound admiration for you, Comrade Morozov. You have taken the greatest revolution the world has ever seen and patched the seat of your pants with it. Comrade, said Morozov with a blue-lipped determination, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, yes, said Timoshenko ruefully. Oh, yes, you do. You know more about it than I do, more than millions of young fools do, that watch us from all over the world with worshipping eyes. You must tell them, Comrade Morozov. You have a lot to tell them. Honestly, comrade, for instance, you know how you made us do it? I don't. All I know is that we have done it. We made a revolution. We had red banners. The banners said that we made it for the world proletariat. We had fools who thought in their doomed hearts that we made it for all those downtrodden ones who suffer on this earth. But you and me, Comrade Morozov, we have a secret. We know, but we won't tell. Why tell? The world doesn't want to hear it. We know that revolution, it was made for you, Comrade Morozov. And hats off to you. Comrade, whoever you are, comrade, Morozov moaned. What do you want? Just to tell you, it's yours, Comrade Morozov. What? Morozov asked, wondering if he was going insane. The revolution, said Timoshenko pleasantly. The revolution. Do you know what a revolution is? I'll tell you. We killed. We killed men in the streets and in the cellars and aboard our ships. Aboard our ships, I remember. There was one boy, an officer, he couldn't have been more than 20. He made the sign of the cross. His mother must have taught him that. He had blood running out of his mouth. He looked at me, his eyes. They weren't frightened anymore. They were kind of astonished about something his mother hadn't taught him. He looked at me. That was the last thing. He looked at me. Drops were rolling down Timoshenko's jowls. He filled a glass and it uttered uncertainly in his hand, trying to find his mouth, and he drank without knowing that he was drinking, his eyes fixed on Morozov's. That's what we did in the year 1917. Now I'll tell you what we did for. Did it for. We did it so that the citizen Morozov could get up in the morning and scratch his belly because the mattress wasn't soft enough, and it made his navel itch. We did it so that he could ride in a big limousine with a down pillow on the seat and a little glass tube for flowers by the window. Lilies of the valley, you know. So that he could drink cognac in a place like this, so that he could scramble up on holidays to a stand all draped in red blunting and make a speech about the proletariat. We did it, Comrade Morozov, and we take a bow. Don't glare at me like that, Comrade Morozov. I'm only your humble servant. I've done my best for you and you should reward me with a smile. Really, you have a lot to thank me for. Comrade, Morozov panted. Let me go. Sit still, Timoshenko roared. Pour yourself a drink. Pour yourself a glass and drink. Do you hear me? Drink, you bastard. Drink and listen. Morozov obeyed. His glass tinkled, shaking against the bottle. You see, said Timoshenko, as if each word were tearing his throat on its way out. I don't mind that we are beaten. I don't mind that we have taken the greatest of crimes on our shoulders and then let it slip through our fingers. I wouldn't mind it if we had been beaten by a tall warrior in a steel helmet, a human dragon spitting fire, but we are beaten by a louse, a big, fat, slow, blonde louse. Ever seen lice? The blonde ones are the fattest. It was our own fault. Once men were ruled with a god's thunder, then they were ruled with a sword. Now they are ruled with a primus. Once they were held by reverence, then they were held by fear. Now they are held by their stomachs. Men have worn chains on their necks and on their wrists and on their ankles. Now they are enchained by their rectums. Only you don't hold heroes by their rectums. It was our own fault. Comrade, for God's sake, comrade, why tell it all to me? We started building a temple. Do we end with a chapel? No, we don't even end with an outhouse. We end with a musty kitchen with a second-hand stuff. We set fire under a kettle and we brewed and stirred and mixed blood and fire and steel. What are we fishing now out of the brew? A new humanity? Men of granite? Or at least a good and horrible monster? No. Little puny things that wiggle. Little things that can bend both ways. Little double-jointed spirits. Little things that don't even bow humbly to be whipped. No, they take the lash obediently and whip themselves. Ever sat at a social activity club meeting? Should. Do you good. Learn a lot about the human spirit. Comrade, Morozov breathed. What do you want? Is it money you want? I'll pay. Timoshenko laughed so loudly that heads turned and Morozov cringed, trying not to be noticed. You louse, Timoshenko roared, laughing. You fool, nearsighted, demented louse. Who do you think you're talking to? Comrade Viktor Dunaev? Comrade Pavel Syrov? Comrade... Morozov roared, so that heads turned to him. But he did not care any longer. You, you have no right to say that. I have nothing whatever to do with Comrade Sairov. I say, Timoshenko remarked slowly. I didn't say you had. Why the excitement? Well, I thought you, I didn't say you had, Timoshenko repeated. I only said you should have. You and he and Viktor Dunaev and about 1 million others, with party cards and stamps affixed. The winners and the conquerors, those who crawl, that pal is the greatest slogan of the men of the future. Those who crawl, listen, do you know how many millions of eyes are watching us across lands and oceans? They're not very close and they can't see very well. They see a big shadow rising. They think it's a huge beast. They are too far to see that it's soft and brownish and fuzzy. You know, fuzzy, a glistening sort of fuzz. They don't know that it's made of cockroaches. Little glossy brown cockroaches packed tight one on the other into a huge ball. Little cockroaches that keep silent and wiggle their whiskers. But the world is too far to see the whiskers. That's what's wrong with the world, Comrade Morozov. They don't see the whiskers. Comrade, what are you talking about? They see a black cloud and they hear thunder. They have been told that behind the clouds, blood is running freely, and men fight, and men kill, and men die. Well, what of it? They, those who watch, are not afraid of blood. There's an honor in blood. But do they know that it's not blood we are bathed in? It's pus. Listen, I'll give you advice. If you want to keep this land in your tentacles, tell the world that you are chopping heads off for breakfast and shooting men by the regiment. Let the world think that you are a huge monster to be feared and respected and fought honorably. But don't let them know that yours is not an army of heroes, not even of fiends, but of shriveled bookkeepers with a rupture who have learned to be arrogant. Don't let them know that you are not to be shot but to be disinfected. Don't let them know that you are not to be fought with cannons but with carbolic acid. Morozov's napkin was crumpled into a drenched ball in his fist. He wiped his forehead once more. He said, trying to make his voice gentle and soothing, trying to rise imperceptibly. You are right, comrade. Those are very fine sentiments. I agree with you absolutely. Now, if you will allow, sit down. Roared Timoshenko. Sit down and drink a toast. Drink it, or I'll shoot you like a mongrel. I still carry a gun, you know. Here. He poured, and a pale golden trickle ran down the tablecloth to the floor. Drink to the men who took a red banner and wiped their ass with it. Morozov drank. Then he put his hand in his pocket and took out a handkerchief to mop his forehead. A crumpled piece of paper fell to the floor. It was the swift, ferocious jerk with which Morozov plunged down for it that made Timoshenko's fist dart out and seize Morozov's hand. What's that, pal? Asked Timoshenko. Morozov's foot kicked the paper out of reach and it rolled under an empty table. Morozov said indifferently, little damp beads sparkling under his wide nostrils. Oh, that. Nothing, comrade, nothing at all, just some scrap of waste paper. Oh, said Timoshenko, watching him with eyes that were alarmingly sober. Oh, just a scrap of waste paper? Well, we'll let it lie there. We'll let the janitor throw it in the waste basket. Yes, Morozov nodded eagerly. That's it, in the waste basket. Very well put, comrade. He giggled, mopping his forehead. We let the janitor throw it in the waste basket. Would you like another drink, comrade? The bottle's empty. The next one's on me. Waiter, another bottle of the same? Sure, said Timoshenko without moving. I'll have another drink. The waiter brought the bottle. Morozov filled the glass, leaning solicitously over the table. He said, regaining his voice syllable by syllable. You know, comrade, I think you misunderstood me, but I don't blame you. I can see your motives and I sympathize thoroughly. There are so many objectionable, or shall we say dishonorable, types these days. One has to be careful. We must get better acquainted, comrade. It's hard to tell at a glance, you know, particularly in a place like this. I bet you thought I was a speculator or something, didn't you? Very funny, isn't it? Very, said Timoshenko. What are you looking down at, Comrade Morozov? Oh, Morozov giggled, jerking his head up. I was just looking at my shoes, comrade. They are sort of tight, you know, uncomfortable. Yes, it's because it's my on my feet so much, you know, in the office. Uh huh, said Timoshenko. Shouldn't neglect your feet. Should take a hot bath when you come home. A pan of hot water with a little vinegar. That's good for sore feet. Oh, indeed. I'm glad you told me. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. I'll be sure and try it first thing when I get home. About time you were getting home, isn't it, Comrade Zorzov? Oh, well, I guess, yeah. It's not too late, not so late yet. And I thought you were in a hurry a little while ago. No, I can't say that I'm in any particular hurry, and besides, such a pleasant. What's the matter, Comrade Morozov? Anything you don't want to leave around here? Who, me? I don't know what that could be, Comrade. Comrade, what did you say your name was, Comrade? Timoshenko. Stephen Timoshenko. It isn't that little scrap of waste paper down there under the table by any chance. Oh, that? Why, Comrade Timoshenko? I had forgotten all about that. What would I want with it? I don't know, said Timoshenko slowly. That's just it, Comrade Timoshenko. Nothing. Nothing at all. Another drink, Comrade Timoshenko? Thanks. Here you are, Comrade. Anything wrong under the table, Comrade Morozov? Why no, Comrade Timoshenko. I was just bending to tie my shoelace. The shoelace is unfastened. Where? Well, isn't that funny? It really isn't unfastened at all. See? And I thought it was. You know how it is, these shoelaces nowadays, not solid at all, not dependable. No, said Timoshenko. They tear like twine. Yes, said Morozov, just like twine, just as you would say, like twine. What are you leaning over for, Comrade Timoshenko? You are not comfortable? Why don't you move over here like this? You'll be more. No, said Timoshenko. I'm just fine here where I am, with a fine view of the table there. I like that table. Nice legs it has, hasn't it? Sort of artistic, you know. Quite right, comrade, very artistic. Now, on the other hand, comrade, there on our left, isn't that a pretty blonde there, by the orchestra? Quite a figure, huh? Yes, indeed, comrade, it's nice shoes you have, Comrade Morozov. Patent leather, too. Bet you didn't get those in cooperative. No, that is to tell you the truth. Well, you see, what I like about them is that bulb right there on the toes, like a bump on someone's forehead, and shiny too. Yup, those foreigners sure know how to make shoes. Speaking of the efficiency of production, comrade, take for instance in the capitalistic countries, in the yes, comrade Morozov, in the capitalistic countries, it was Morozov who leaped for the letter. It was Timoshenko who caught his wrist with fingers like talons, and for one brief moment they were on their hands and knees on the floor, and their eyes met silently like those of two beasts in deadly battle. Then Timoshenko's other hand seized the letter, and he rose slowly, releasing Morozov, and sat down at the table. He was reading the letter while Morozov was still on his hand and knees, staring up at him with eyes of a man awaiting the verdict of a court martial. Morozov, you goddamn bastard. If you don't come across with what's due me before tomorrow morning, you'll eat breakfast at the GPU, and you know what that means. Affectionately, Pavel Syrov. Morozov was sitting at the table when Timoshenko raised his head from the letter. Timoshenko laughed as Morozov had never heard a man laugh. Timoshenko rose slowly, laughing. His stomach shook, and his rabbit fur collar and the sinews of his bare throat. He swayed a little and he held the letter in both hands. Then his laughter died down slowly, smoothly, like a gramophone record, unwinding to a low, coughing chuckle on a single dry note. He slipped the letter into his pocket and turned slowly. His shoulders stooped, his movement suddenly awkward, humble. He shuffled heavily, uncertainly to the door. At the door, the maitre de hotel glanced at him sideways. Timoshenko returned the glance. Timoshenko's glance was gentle. Morozov sat at the table, one hand frozen in mid-air in an absurd, twisted position like the hand of a paralytic. He heard Timoshenko's chuckle, dropping down the stairway, monotonous, disjointed chuckles that sounds like hiccups, like barks, like sobs. He jumped up suddenly. Oh my God, he moaned. Oh my God. He ran, forgetting his hat and coat, down the long stairs, out in the snow. In the broad, white, silent streets, Timoshenko was nowhere in sight. Morozov did not send the money to Pavel Syrov. He did not go to his own office at the Food Trust. He sat all the following morning, all of the afternoon at home, in his room and drank vodka. Whenever he heard the telephone or the doorbell ringing, he crouched, his head in his shoulder, and bit his knuckles. Nothing happened. At dinner time, Antonina Pavlovna brought the evening paper and threw it into his snapping, "What the hell is the matter with you today?" He glanced through the paper. There were news item on the front page. In the village Vasilkino in the Kama region, the peasants, goaded by the counter-revolutionary Hodor element, burned the local club of Karl Marx. The bodies of the club president and secretary, party comrades from Moscow, were found in the charred ruins. A GPU squad is on its way to Vasilkino. In the village Swersko, 25 peasants were executed last night for the murder of the village correspondent, a young comrade from the staff of Communist Union of Youth newspaper in Samara. The peasants refused to divulge the name of the murderer. On the last page was a short item. The body of Stefan Timoshenko, former sailor of the Baltic Fleet, was found early this morning under a bridge on the ice of Obikovsky Canal. He had shot himself through the mouth. No papers save his party card were found on the body to explain the reason for his suicide. Morozov wiped his forehead as if a noose had been slipped off his throat and drank 2 glasses of vodka. When the phone rang, he swaggered boldly to take the receiver, and Antonina Pavlovna wondered why he was chuckling. "Morozov," a muffled voice whispered over the wire. "That you, Pavlusha?" Morozov asked. "Listen, pal, I'm awfully sorry, but I have the money and—" "Forget the money," Syrov hissed. "It's all right. Listen, did I leave you a note yesterday?" "Why, yes, but I guess I deserved it, and—" "Have you destroyed it?" "Why?" "Nothing, only you understand what it could—" "Have you destroyed it?" Morozov looked at the evening paper, grinned, and said, "Sure I have. Forget about it, pal." He held the paper in his hand all evening long. "The fool," he muttered under his breath, so that Antonina Pavlovna looked at him inquisitively, chin forward. "The damn fool! He lost it. Wandered about all night, God knows where, the drunken fool. He lost it." Morozov did not know that Stefan Shimoshenko had come home from the European roof garden and sat at a rickery table in his unheated garret and written painstakingly a letter on a piece of brown wrapping paper in the light of a dying candle in a green bottle, that he had folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an old envelope and slipped another scrap of paper, wrinkled and creased, into the envelope and written Andrei Taganov's address on it. That he had sealed the letter and had gone steadily, unhurriedly, down the creaking stairs into the street. The letter on the brown wrapping paper said, "Dear friend Andre, I promised to say goodbye, and here it is. It's not quite what I promised, but I guess you will forgive me. I'm sick of seeing what I see, and I can't stand to see it any longer. To you, as my only legacy, I'm leaving the letter you will find enclosed. It's a hard legacy, I know. I only hope that you won't follow me too soon. Your friend, Stefan Timoshenko." That brings us to the end of chapter 10. We'll be reading the next chapter in our next recording. Well, there comes the role of Kira. Okay, if you liked, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe. If there are any comments, any kind of criticism, feedback, anything at all, positive, negative, anything at all, you can reach out to me in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section. Even right now, if you have any kind of comments you want to say, you can write in the chat. We'll be reading chapter 11 in the next recording. I will be uploading this in the channel's playlist. Stopping the recording. Bye bye. Keep reading. Take care.